There are two phases to any portrait drawing, the laying phase and the shading phase. Although many artists put a lot of emphasis on the shading phase, the lay-in is arguably the most important. It is the foundation of your portrait. This is where we capture the likeness and gesture of our subject. Get the lay-in wrong and all the shading in the world won't fix your portrait. So with that said, let's go over the different methods for drawing a good lay-in. There are two main ways to draw the lay-in, the grid method and the freehand method. The grid method is the easier of the two, so let's go over that one first. As the name suggests, with the grid method, we draw a grid on our reference photo. In this example, I'll divide the side of the reference into 6 equal sections. And I'll divide the top into 4 equal sections. I chose these dimensions because they were the easiest, but you can divide up your reference in any way you like. Then we'll draw the same grid on the drawing paper. Now, using these grids as a guide, we can copy the reference photo over to our drawing paper. We can look at the intersection between the grid and our reference and use these landmarks to keep our lines accurate. For example, I can see that the outline of the baby's forehead intersects with the grid at this point, and this point. So I'll mark them out on my paper and use them to help me draw the curve. Continuing with this process, I can see that the outline of the nose intersects at this point, and this point. Next, I can see that the baby's hand fits into these 2 corner boxes, so I'll sketch it in. And I know that the nostril of the nose will go into the upper left corner of this box here. The grid will also tell me where to place the eyes, as well as how large to make them. As you can see, having this grid as a guide makes the drawing so much easier. And once finished, we would carefully erase the guidelines on the drawing paper and carry on with the shading. By the way, because we end up erasing the guidelines, it's a good idea to draw them in very lightly in the first place. When using this method, you'll be surprised at how accurate your drawing will be, even if you have little experience. So if you're a beginner, I highly recommend you try this method to help you get started and build some confidence. Here are some tips to help you get the most out of this technique. Use a plastic overlay. It can be cumbersome to have to put a grid on your reference for every drawing. One shortcut is to draw the grid onto a plastic sleeve like this one using permanent ink. Then you can simply insert different references into the sleeve. That way you only have to draw the grid on your drawing paper. Enlarging or shrinking your reference. Another cool thing about this technique is that you can use it to manipulate the size of your reference. For instance, suppose you were drawing on a very small photograph like this one, and you would like the drawing to be larger. All you would have to do is make the grid on your drawing paper larger. In this case, however big the individual square on the reference is, I simply double that size for my drawing paper. So now when you complete the drawing, it will be twice as big as your reference. You can also use the same technique in reverse to shrink down a large reference. Using a simple grid. One objection many artists have to using a grid is that although it delivers results very quickly, it can become a bit of a crutch. And there's some truth to this. If you rely on it exclusively, the grid will limit your growth. That's why I recommend you use it only as a stepping stone in the early stages of learning. Many artists have the limiting belief that they can't draw an accurate portrait. I know I definitely suffered from this when I was starting out. And nothing shattered this belief better than just sitting down and drawing your first realistic portrait. The grid method can help you do this very quickly, and in that sense, it's a great learning tool. However, to prevent it from becoming a crutch, one thing you could do is gradually decrease the dimension of your grid. For example, in the beginning, you might start out with a very detailed grid like this one. But as you become more confident, you might want to try a simpler grid, and eventually an even simpler one. The simpler the grid, the more freehand drawing you'll have to do, and this will force you to grow as an artist. Use a modified grid. In addition to the simple grid, you can also use a modified grid. The modified grid is essentially a 2x2 grid with diagonals drawn through the center. To construct it, first simply draw in two diagonals connecting each corner. The point where they intersect will represent the perfect center of the reference. Then simply draw a vertical and horizontal line through this point to complete the grid. The modified grid offers the same guidance as a normal grid while being very convenient and simple. Nowadays, whenever I use the grid method, I almost always use the modified grid. As you can see, the grid method has many amazing benefits, especially for beginners. But it does come with some limitations, one of which is that it can only be used on photo references. So, although I recommend you use it as a learning tool in the beginning, as you become more advanced, you'll probably want to move on to the more versatile freehand method, which we'll cover in the next lesson.